Have you ever felt hopeless when you think about differentiating yourself and when you really turn the questions inward and you go, how am I different? What makes me stand out? What makes this show something that people will want to listen to? Feels like there are hundreds of shows out there like this already. And there may not be, right? But in your mind, you feel like, wow, I have no advantages here. How am I going to actually do this? And that is one of the most paralyzing thoughts, because I consult with clients regularly when it comes to starting or growing their podcasts. And just today, talking with somebody who's multimillionaire, very established, but not knowing how to articulate your story, not knowing how to communicate your unfair advantages can make the rest of the process feel pointless. And so if you're in a position where you already have a podcast and you're feeling stuck, or, things have stalled out, a lot of times it's the fact that, you're not excited about some of these unfair advantages that you might already possess. So in this video, I'm going to go through the 5 things that you can kind of go through as a checklist and immediately put this to use after the video. My name is Misbah Haque, by the way. In 2016, I started my first podcast that landed me my dream job, coaching Fortune 1000 executives and professional athletes. Then I went on to launch a show that did over 1 million downloads. And now I write about high agency thinking and skill acquisition on my newsletter, Habit Chess, which, by the way, you can sign up for that. Link in the description or at mishq.com. So let's start with where I got this concept from. Okay, so this book, The Unfair Advantage, I first came across it about 1.5 years ago. I think it was Ali Abdaal's channel that he did a book review or something of the sort on it. And I remember the title just immediately grabbing my attention and being like, ooh, I need to read this. And so I did. And I love coming back to books, after a year has passed, over a year has passed, because that's the true test of what actually stuck and what you implemented and, what the biggest takeaways were, right? Because without having to go through and reread all of this again, I can tell you the 5 most important things that I want you to take away from this that will help you find your unfair advantages. But of course, if you want to check out the full book, I'll link that up in the description too. It's definitely worth a read. So yes, this book does talk about business and applying it to the startup world and all these other things. But to me, these are universal concepts that you can take and definitely apply to the podcasting space. So the 5 concepts that I'm about to go over, by the way, is of course applicable to things that are outside of podcasting as well. In this book, it was written in the context of business and startups and things of that nature. But I feel like once you master these concepts, you can take them and, in any venture that you're on, use them to figure out your unfair advantages. So let's start with the framework. It's called the Miles framework, and each letter stands for something. So the M in Miles stands for money. Now, money can be an advantage, right? You can buy better equipment. You can maybe fly out your guests. You can book live studio time, all that cool stuff. But the cool thing about this book is it explores the other side of these unfair advantages. So if you don't have a lot of money, that in and of itself is an unfair advantage. Because think about when you're telling somebody that you have a lot of money, it doesn't sound great, right? It doesn't sound like a flex. But when you come at it with like, look, I started out, I didn't have a lot of money. I got a microphone for $50 and lasted me 5 years. Like, those are the things that you can begin to look at. Okay, where are the areas that I can lean into if I don't have money to start? That can feel very relieving a lot of times, instead of feeling like you have to put on this front of making it seem like money is this big unfair advantage of yours. So keep that in mind, because that principle carries through the rest of these letters in the framework, where you can either have it and it's an advantage, or if you don't have it, you can also turn that into an advantage. And an example of that is when I first started my podcast, I was in my childhood bedroom and I had a really, $50 microphone. It was a very janky setup, but at the same time, that was my advantage. It was something that when guests would come on, it's not like they would judge me for it. They would actually kind of probably respect it to some extent, because it's like, wow, look, this person's still making it work despite whatever weird setup they got going on, right? So a lot of times when you're acting despite the fact that you don't have money, that can be seen as very taking initiative, very ambitious, and very honorable a lot of times. So the I in Miles framework stands for intelligence and insight. Now, this does not mean book smarts all the time. It can be creativity. It could be social intelligence. Whatever these things are, though, again, look for whether I do have them or I don't have them. Because let's say you're not a very intelligent person. You don't consider yourself to be. The fact that, let's say, say you are connecting with really big guests, or you're talking about really cool things and people are enjoying your stuff, think about how later on, if you talked about it, you were like, yeah, I mean, I'm not super smart. I didn't go to school for this thing, but I was just super curious about it and, loved uncovering insights from people that I talked to. So that angle of framing it is like, look, I don't have a ton of intelligence around this, but I am relentlessly curious, right? That can be a way to position that if you feel like the intelligence and insight aspect is a disadvantage for you. Something I want to point out so far with money and with intelligence is when it is an advantage for you, it's not something you're blatantly expressing, right? You're just kind of doing. Like if you have a lot of money already, then go get the studio time, go get the nice cameras, go buy the guests, go buy the ads, right? But you're not necessarily communicating that as the unfair advantage, versus if you don't have those things, you do have a reason and a way to kind of communicate that and be like, yep, that is an unfair advantage. I did it without that stuff. Now, the L in the Miles framework is for location or luck. Location is like, okay, if I was really into tech and now I'm in the Bay Area or in the Valley, okay, I have the advantage of being in a location where a lot of that stuff occurs. If you're a comedian, right, you have the advantage of being in a New York or LA or in Austin now. Those are areas where you are more bound to come across lucky situations. Now, if you don't have access to that location, if I live in Idaho or Egypt or whatever, those still can be turned into advantages. It's like, yeah, I didn't do comedy in LA or New York. I actually stuck around in Idaho and the Midwest and, just did stuff in my hometown. So that is something really to consider, is location and luck. If you are in LA, and you have access to a lot of really nice studios that you can rent, and a lot of famous guests, high profile guests also live there, right? So it might be easier for somebody who's in LA to get guests to come out and, do an in-person episode, versus let's say if you live in Wisconsin, okay, that might be a little harder for you to do that. Now, luck is sometimes dependent upon the location, but it doesn't have to be. It can be its own thing where you had a couple lucky breaks, or you happen to be in the right time, prepared for the right opportunity when it came to you. What was that? What is that? Can you talk about that thing? Because most likely there is an unfair advantage hidden in there if you feel like it was lucky. And again, if you did not have the location, you had no luck at all, you in fact have very bad luck, that's a great advantage for you to lean into, right? Talk about how you don't have a lot of lucky situations. This took a long time for you. It took a lot of grit and grind. Versus if you had that luck, those could be framed in a way where it's like, whoa, look at how cool that is. That's pretty awesome. You were able to make that happen. Now, the E in the Miles framework stands for education. So education can be, of course, the school that you went to. If you went to Harvard or you went to Stanford or some big Ivy League school, it's like you should absolutely be leaning into that as an unfair advantage, because those types of symbols are definitely ones that it's one word, right? But the credibility check is already done. It's the same way as if you said, hi, I'm Dr. Misbah, whatever, right? It's like, oh, cool, you're a doctor. It kind of checks off something in your brain credibility wise, if that's what I'm going to be talking about. But again, let's flip this. So let's say I didn't go to Harvard. I didn't go to Stanford. Maybe I didn't even graduate high school. So if I didn't graduate high school and I still made a successful podcast and I, whatever, look back at that and go, wow, like I didn't have a lot of education, yet look how I was still able to figure it out and do this, right? And so there's a forcing function of not having that education or any one of these advantages sometimes, which is it forces you to figure out the alternative. You have to get creative with the resources that you do have. So the S in the Miles framework stands for status. Now, this does not just have to be like, oh, I worked at a Google, or I was the CFO at a Amazon, or something really huge like that. It can also be your network. Let's say that you are, Justin Bieber, okay? If Justin Bieber wanted to start a podcast tomorrow, like he knows a lot of people, and he could probably get those people in his first 3 episodes to be like mega stars, mega heavy hitters. And so status is one that you see a lot of people use if they have access to it, because it's stupid not to, right? If you have access to, some of the biggest names in the world who would help accelerate the growth of your show, like 10x, 50x, why not take advantage of that? And so I want you to kind of pay attention to this with some of your favorite shows and people that you watch. Status is heavily deployed once you have it. So if a show has really big names and and big guests and they've kind of built up that reputation already, then okay, that show is more likely to lean into status as the unfair advantage because it's so hard to come by and it was hard to kind of acquire. So why not use it while we can? But now let's look at a lack of status. So if you don't have status, there is a crazy lack, right, that you might be feeling compared to your peers, compared to other competitors or whatever. And that drive that creates, a lot of times, like I have no status whatsoever to lean on. I literally just have to focus on being as good as I possibly can in every moment, in every interaction. It's quite remarkable, the forcing function that a lack of status can actually give you. Having a lack of status is something that I often use for my own unfair advantages, because if you hear me, I tell you, hey, in 2016, I started my very first podcast and it was out of my childhood bedroom. I had no credibility, no audience. It was a fitness podcast. I wasn't a professional athlete. I hadn't been to the Olympics. I didn't have biceps the size of my head. I hadn't yet worked with, celebrities or professional athletes or any of those things I could lean into. I always mention that line to really get across the fact that, I had no status. And then within a couple episodes and within a year, I was able to have enough status for me to land that dream job and do a couple other things. So that was the Miles framework. Again, from this book, The Unfair Advantage. The Miles framework is something that I feel you can apply to your podcast on a macro level when you are kind of being strategic about the show or about yourself and your own personal brand or your own stories. But I also feel like the unfair advantage can be applied on a very molecular level. For example, if I'm trying to get better every single episode, I might ask myself, okay, for this next episode, do I have money? Can I lean into that? Can I go, upgrade my production quality? Can I lean on my status? Do I have access to some, cool guests that would deliver a lot of value to my audience? But I think the other thing that's very interesting about all this is because podcasting is not always solo. You do have solo shows like mine sometimes, but you have ones that are with a co-host or with a guest. And so you are often in a position where if you are lacking some of these unfair advantages, like, the education on a topic or, intelligence and insight on something, you have the ability to go find someone who has that unfair advantage and feature them, give them a chance to showcase their stuff. And remember, because the association is still with you, you're the one who created that space, you're the one who's providing that platform, you're guiding the conversation, you're asking the questions, you are still associated with that result. Coming back to that last one, status, right? You're still associated. Your status is kind of going up a tiny bit while you are associating with someone who seems to have high status. So I hope you can see how the Miles framework can apply on a macro level to your podcast and for other ventures you've got going on, or that it can also apply on a micro level. And by a micro level, I mean, let's say on an episode by episode basis. So I tried to get 1% better on each episode that I did. So I'd often think, okay, how can I make this one better? If let's say money was my unfair advantage, it's like, let's do some really high quality production stuff, right? Let's get a lot more clips made because I can afford it. Let's say I don't have a lot of status yet, or I might not have a lot of education on this particular topic. Well, you can go find someone, you can find a guest to actually have on to feature that unfair advantage. Because podcasts, remember, it's similar to like putting on an event or a conference. You are getting credit for creating the space, for bringing the people together, for bringing the questions, guiding the conversation, packaging it up, and shipping all of it. This is the reason why the person who organizes the event at a conference does not have to be the only one speaking the whole time, right? They're often showcasing 5 other people to help strengthen their position in whatever they're doing. So for you, if you don't have a ton of status, having guests on who have a little bit of status is actually, it's rubbing off on you, right? That does elevate you a tiny bit. It's not overnight and doesn't just happen with one guest, and it can also backlash. But when you do it repeatedly, you're able to now acquire that unfair advantage of having some status. Now, education. If you're feeling like, oh man, this topic's something I don't know a ton about, but I really want to learn about it and I really want to share it with my audience. Those 2 things are the main things that you just need to actually move forward with the idea. If you were sitting there writing, an article about that thing, okay, you might feel a little more ill-equipped to do that. But remember, podcasts are a platform to have conversations. So if you wanted to have a guest on to talk about this thing, again, there's a way where you can fill in the gap with that unfair advantage and then also use it to acquire that unfair advantage, right? So that's what I love about using this concept in the context of podcasting is not only does it help you actually acquire these unfair advantages. If you wanted to, you can really channel yourself and your show to acquire them. To be quite frank, that's what I did with my very first show, because 2016 didn't have a lot of credibility, and, things really added up and changed the trajectory of the next decade for me from doing some of this stuff. So I hope this framework gave you some confidence in giving you a structure to be able to not just leave it up to chance, like, oh, I have no status or no education, this is just how it is for the rest of my life, or I'm unlucky, this is just how it's going to be. I find it very encouraging to, one, own some of the things that are unfair advantages, to acknowledge ones that aren't, because again, it doesn't make you feel bad. You're like, oh, well, I can flip it and turn it into something useful. But the coolest thing to me is the fact that we can acquire some of these unfair advantages through the very art of learning in public with podcasting. So comment below with which one of these surprised you the most, which one of these are you going to put into play. I'd love to hear from you on that. And then of course, check out some of the links and stuff in the description below. I've always got free tools, free strategy calls, consulting, things to make podcasting easier for you and more accessible.